Thank you all for joining in person and also online. My name is Dr. Chirij Bajpayee. I am the Senior Research Fellow for South Asia at Chatham House. Today's event will be looking at Pakistan. Obviously, we'll be focusing on the election, which is scheduled to take place later this week, fingers crossed. But we'll also be looking beyond the election to broader regional developments as they pertain to Pakistan. And Pakistan clearly appears to be in the midst of a perfect storm of sorts. It's facing a dire economic situation. As most of you will know, it's in the midst of its 23rd IMF bailout. It's facing a difficult security situation with a string of recent terrorist attacks. Most recently, yesterday, we saw an attack in KP province in which over 10 policemen were killed. It's facing difficult relations with its neighbors, as we've seen most recently with Iran. The country is also vulnerable to climate risks, as we saw with the devastating impact of the floods 2 years ago. So we'll be addressing some of these issues in today's event, and we have an excellent panel of speakers. Joining us from from Islamabad, apologies. Joining us from Islamabad is Dr. Malia Lodi. Ambassador Lodi has served as Pakistan's High Commissioner to the UK. She's also served twice as ambassador to the United States and most recently held the position of permanent representative to the United Nations. And then joining me here in person is Dr. Adnan Nazimullah, who is a reader in international politics at King's College London. And at the far end is our associate fellow, Dr. Farzana Sheikh. So a lot of doctors in the house. So we will start with a guided discussion for the first 30 to 40 minutes led by myself, and then we will open up to questions from the audience. So on that note, let's begin with Ambassador Lodi. And I wanted to start with perhaps the foreign policy picture. So Ambassador Lodi, Pakistan's relations with its neighbors, I wanted to get your thoughts on how do you assess that on the eve of the election. We've seen recent remarks by the Army Chief, Asim Munir, where he made some quite scathing comments about Pakistan's neighbors, Afghanistan, India, and Iran. So my question is, how do you read this? Was this a warning shot to Pakistan's neighbors, or a signal to the next Prime Minister not to cross red lines on foreign policy?
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be joining your panelists at Chatham House. I wish I could have been there in person, but I guess these days you can be there in so many other ways. So thanks to technology, here I am in Islamabad. I think one needs to understand that the broad thrust of Pakistan's foreign policy has remained very consistent. So I think one should not expect any dramatic or substantial changes. Our relations at the moment, unfortunately, in the neighborhood are very fraught. As you know, there were airstrikes by Iran on Pakistani territory, and then Pakistan responded. But I have to say, this was the quickest kiss and make-up session that I've ever seen between two countries, because we had then the Iranian foreign minister coming, and there was a spirit of reconciliation, because I think both countries realize that they have to do a better job at border management, because that's what led to the strikes. Iran has long claimed, just like Pakistan has long claimed, that there are armed groups on the other side of the border that they need to do something about to contain them. So, relationship with Iran remains, I would think, that the airstrikes or the trading of airstrikes has damaged the relationship, even though both countries have sought to make up after that and are trying to put relations back on track. Then, of course, we have the testy relationship, increasingly testy relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban in Afghanistan. 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan once again, there was this sentiment of this feeling in Islamabad that somehow Pakistan would be able to secure its western border because the Taliban would be friendlier towards Pakistan for obvious reasons. Well, that didn't happen. That expectation was not realized. And since then, relations have been very strained between the two countries, largely, if not entirely, because of Pakistan's insistence that the Taliban in Kabul do something about restricting, containing, and in fact, dismantling what is called the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the armed group which is outlawed in Pakistan, which operates from Afghan territory. And there has been a surge in these terrorist attacks after the Taliban took over. In fact, the UN Security Council Sanctions Committee, UN Sanctions Committee report, even a recent one, in fact, has said that the TTP has gained the most out of all the terrorist groups that are residing in Afghanistan from the return of the Taliban. So we have this relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan, as I said, which is strained, but clearly it is Pakistan's strategic imperative to keep that relationship in on a stable track. And then, of course, we have our biggest neighbor, India. Again, relations plunged to a new low, although that has been the history of this adversarial relationship. But it plunged to a new low when India illegally annexed occupied Jammu and Kashmir in August 2019. After that, although dialogue had been suspended between the two countries even earlier, but after that, Pakistan then suspended trade, and both countries recalled their high commissioners. So really, practical issues are still dealt with by the two countries at a junior kind of diplomatic level, but that relationship is frozen. So I think the next government has to come in and deal with this situation of fraught relations with three neighbors. And remember, Pakistan's security policy has always been predicated on trying to avoid a two-front situation. In other words, two hot borders. But now the challenge that looms is dealing with a three-front scenario, as it were, even though they're not all hot fronts, but still, as I said, there are unstable relations with three neighbors. And given Pakistan's overriding priority for any government coming in, whatever its political complexion, its overriding priority will have to be to get an economy that is in the critical ward out of that ICU. Now, for that, Pakistan needs a peaceful neighborhood. The last thing it wants is to be distracted by what is happening on the borders. So this being the most overriding strategic objective for any government coming in, I think we have to wait and see how Pakistan is able to then deal with relations with these three neighbors.
Thank you, Ambassador Lodhi. And we will come back to Pakistan's relations with each of these countries. But perhaps before we move on to the domestic politics, I wanted to come back to the issue of Iran, because it was quite an unusual flare-up of tensions between Iran and Pakistan. I mean, they characterized their relationship as a brotherly relationship. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, was it just a flash in the pan moment, because they renormalized relations relatively quickly, or is this a sign of potential instabilities from the Middle East spilling over into South Asia?
I think what happened came as a big surprise to Islamabad, because relations, in fact, between the two countries had been improving very steadily, especially after the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which had opened up greater diplomatic space for Pakistan to forge greater economic ties with Iran. And some of these new agreements did get into place after that. So this was a big surprise why Iran took this action. And I think the fact that very quickly the two countries were able to, diffuse tensions very, very fast. And the Iranian foreign minister coming here after their National Security Council took a decision that they must improve relations with Pakistan, mend ties with Pakistan. I mean, that may have been an acknowledgement of the error or the mistake that Iran had made. Don't forget that at the same time, Iran, launched this airstrike. It also launched strikes against in Iraq and Syria. So in Iraq and one other, I think it was two other countries. So three countries at the same time for them to do. I think flash in the pan. Look, relations, even at the best of times between Pakistan and Iran, have been mired in suspicion. There's no doubt about that. The surprise was that because the last couple of years relations had moved beyond this trust deficit between the two. And Iran's suspicions about Pakistan date to the Islamic Revolution, because from then on, the Iranian regime has somehow felt that Pakistan is too closely aligned with the West, especially with the United States after 9/11. And therefore, Islamabad was viewed by suspicion from Tehran's point of view. On the Pakistani side, I think also Pakistan felt that the Iranians, initially after the Islamic Revolution, tried to export that revolution because Pakistan is a very large Shia community. Of course, that never happened, but the suspicion was there. So there is a history of mutual suspicion. But I think the important thing now is that the two countries have stepped back from what could have been a very, very dangerous escalation in the crisis. And the crisis was very short-lived. But as I said before, the relationship really does need to be mended because it has been damaged. There's no doubt about it. When one country attacks another through airstrikes and goes into the other country's territory, I mean, sure, that really doesn't, I mean, it can't be repeated again. I think that Pakistan has sent very strong messages to the Iranian leadership that it will not sit back if Iran was to try something like that again. So that's where we are right now.
And we will come back to the foreign policy issue, but perhaps I can turn to you, Farzana, at this point, on the elections, which are coming up in a few days. Maybe you can set the scene for us. I mean, how did we get here? How did we get from, say, April 2022, when Imran Khan was removed from power, to where we are today? And how do you see the situation evolving? Is another Sharif government a foregone conclusion? What about Imran Khan? He's obviously barred from standing in the election, but we've seen candidates from his party, the PTI, have continued to campaign using social media, have continued to use AI-generated speeches from Imran Khan. And then, the elephant in the room, what role does the so-called establishment, the military and intelligence services, play in this election?
Well, it's received, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Chitej, of course, for chairing this meeting on Pakistan just days before the country goes to the polls. I mean, it's received the country and its polls this week have been widely covered in the media, and I'm sure that most of you in this room will be broadly familiar with the outlines of how we got here. Basically, in April 2022, former Prime Minister Imran Khan was controversially ousted from office, though legally through a parliamentary vote of no confidence. The report suggested that much of that had to do with the fact that he and his government fell out with the military establishment, particularly over military appointments, over which Imran Khan wanted to have some say. But to cut a long story short, relations between the two sides, once extremely rosy, deteriorated sharply after that. And so, in that sort of climate of hostility, then we had Imran Khan, as I said, removed and replaced with a coalition government that lasted about a year before elections were finally called, a coalition government headed by former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz and the Pakistan People's Party. They stepped down and were replaced by a caretaker government headed by caretaker Prime Minister Anwarul Haq Kakar, who are now overseeing a process towards elections. Now, Pakistan, of course, as we all know, goes to the polls on the 8th, on Thursday. And despite widespread speculation that the outcome has already been decided, there are many still who hope that of the 128 million registered voters, that the majority will still be given a chance to decide the results of these elections. Now, at play will be three main and many lesser parties, but only two, the Pakistan Muslim League led by former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and the Pakistan People's Party under the joint chairmanship of Asif Ali Zardari and young Bilawal Bhutto will be in with a chance of forming the next government. The other convincing front-runner, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, led by former Prime Minister Imran Khan, has been barred, if not effectively banned, from campaigning freely. That too has received widespread coverage in the press, both at home and abroad. It faces restrictions on access to the media, and most recently has also faced the wrath of the courts through a controversial ruling which stripped the party of its election symbol, the cricket bat, forcing the party's candidates to contest these elections, not as candidates of the PTI, but as independents. And I think what needs to be underscored and emphasized here is the significance of this ruling and its power to cause confusion, especially in a country where almost 48% of the population are illiterate, and where many rely on election symbols to guide them to candidates of their choice. The PTI's leader, Imran Khan, of course, meanwhile, has been barred from contesting the polls. He is currently in jail, where he was sentenced last week to extended prison terms for corruption, for breaches of national security, and most recently for having contracted a marriage in breach of Islamic rules. Now, despite these draconian measures against the PTI and despite the many restrictions placed on it, many people still understand that the real battle this week will still involve the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, led by former Prime Minister Sharif, and Khan's PTI, with the electoral field, as we have seen, decisively skewed against the PTI. Now, much of this struggle will be concentrated in the powerful province of Punjab, with its lion's share of seats in the National Assembly, where both parties are expected to hold their ground. And many expect Sharif to use the support of pro-military parties who are backing him, and the backing of so-called electables, these local notables with significant vote banks at their disposal in Punjab and Balochistan, to try and offset, as it were, the PTI's popularity, especially in provinces like the northwestern province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Now, of course, both parties are likely to use their support across these provinces to boost their claims to represent the only two genuinely national parties in Pakistan. By contrast, the Pakistan People's Party, despite a spirited campaign mounted by Bilawal Zardari, is really not expected to make significant gains much beyond its native province of Sindh, risking its relegation to the status of a provincial party.
So can I just ask, so as of now, it seems like the most likely outcome is obviously the PTI being sidelined, a weak coalition government led by one of the Sharif brothers, and a power-sharing arrangement with the establishment? And if so, how sustainable or stable is that arrangement or situation?
Well, we will just have to wait and see, and I think much of that really will depend on turnout. And why does that matter? Because I think a very low, an uncomfortably low turnout of, let's say, 41, 44% would certainly put in question the representative credentials of any new government. And that would certainly not bode well for the stability of any such government, with or without the support of the military establishment.
Adnan, if I could turn to you, and maybe it's a bit premature to be looking beyond the election, but we will see that the term of the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and expire at the end of this, I think it's November of this year, and then the Army Chief's term also the following year. So given that these changes that we're about to see, do you see any prospect for Imran Khan's eventual rehabilitation, similar to what we've seen with Nawaz Sharif over the last few months?
I think that so we should remember, actually, that Nawaz Sharif was being treated very badly by the judiciary and implicitly by the military in 2018, when the military was really supporting, or the establishment was really supporting Imran Khan against the sort of the Nawaz Sharif's, the PMLN. There seems to be a major difference between the situation in 2018, where Nawaz Sharif got rehabilitated and is likely to become the next prime minister, and Imran Khan. Imran Khan crossed a couple of very key lines in his relationship to the military by, for example, mobilizing within the military, claiming that he represented the rank and file of the military's interests better than the military leadership. Now, of course, that sort of challenges the sort of feigned cohesiveness and coherence of this very powerful institution. The other thing he did, and if any of you here are sort of fans of Trump world, there was a very similar sort of insurrection, if you want, in May 2023, just at the moment in which Imran Khan was worried about getting arrested, called his supporters out to the streets, and they clashed with the police, which of course political parties do, but then some of those supporters actually attacked military establishments and looted and committed arson in the Lahore Corps commander's residence. A three-star general had to jump from the back wall to sort of escape this mob. Now, of course, that seems to be like a big sort of challenge to the military's authority within its own bailiwick. So I think that Imran Khan is possibly being understood as more dangerous, partly because he also has continued this sort of campaign against the military and the sort of leadership of the establishment in a way that Nawaz Sharif has always has been on the wrong side of the military more than once. In 1999 and 2018, but has a sort of a more established sets of relationships and ways of being and doing with the military, relative to Imran Khan, who is sort of the one-man kind of charismatic, but also somewhat messianic sort of figure, sort of a classic populist who's sort of mobilizing those who are being unrepresented by the system, but in so doing challenging sort of the institutional configuration of the country.
So given the likelihood of some sort of weak coalition government, I wanted to ask you, Adnan, about the politics of patronage, which is obviously very prominent in Pakistan, and the challenge of balancing austerity measures, which will be required as part of any IMF bailout, with the need to appease these patronage networks. And how do you see this playing out in the context of another government which is likely to be weak and unstable, potentially?
Well, one of the things that I think is worth noting is that established parties like the PPP in Sindh, the PMLN, especially in Punjab, have very, very developed and established networks of patronage, of the provision of basic public goods for their supporters that have developed over time, and in which the recipients of the patronage, citizens and voters, are actually quite assertive in relation to the government about what they need, to the point where, you know, a party might nominate or seek to nominate sort of a local notable, and the local the local community and the local party workers might actually just reject him. Now, the problem with the PTI is that the PTI doesn't really have any party organization. It's sort of Imran Khan as a sort of sole figure. But the PTI is representing a very powerful and now politically activated population among middle class, especially middle class urban Pakistanis, quite conservative, but are not sort of situated within these established patronage networks. Now, the one exception to a sort of an urban patronage network, which was the Mutahida or Muhajir Qawmi movement, the MQM, has sort of been disassembled by the security services, actually around about 2017, 2018. So in some senses, there's representation without patronage with the PTI, and then with the other parties, you have patronage without representation.
I can see several questions already coming in on the chat, and unsurprisingly, they're focused on foreign policy. So perhaps I can turn back to you, Ambassador Lodhi, on the broader regional and global environment. And my first question here is that Pakistan seems to have lost some of its strategic significance in the West following the US and NATO withdrawals from Afghanistan in 2021. And yet the country obviously remains strategically important. It's the world's 5th most populous country, 2/3 of whom are below the age of 30. Pakistan obviously matters from a security standpoint, given its nuclear weapons capability and the fact that it holds the world's 6th largest military, and of course the flashpoint with India. And we saw the Army Chief Asim Munir traveling to Washington, to the US, in December, where he met with several key US officials. So my question to you is, how do you assess Pakistan's relationship with the West and perhaps the US more specifically at present and going forward following the election?
Well, I think one has to look at what the broad parameters of Pakistan's foreign policy objectives are. Pakistan's overriding sort of priority is its strategic relationship with China. So I think we need to keep that in view as we examine Pakistan's relations with the West. With the United States, you're absolutely right. After the US military withdrawal from Afghanistan, Pakistan's value diminished in Washington's eyes. And therefore, since then, the relationship actually has been in a state of flux. It's in a tentative phase. The US still, of course, has intense engagement with Pakistan. But because Afghanistan was the main common element between the two countries for almost 2 decades, if not more, the bilateral content of the relationship over that period was actually very weak or very narrow. And therefore, I think both countries are looking towards, after elections in both America and in Pakistan, at the possibility of a reset in the relationship. And that reset would have to sort of take into consideration and find space between two other relationships: Pakistan's strategic relationship with China and America's much closer and strategic relationship with India. So it's between these two relationships that space has to be found for the Pakistan-US relationship. Because, as you know, and so does the audience, that for America right now, its overriding priority is containment of China. And therefore, because Pakistan is unwilling to be part of any kind of anti-China coalition, it does reduce the space for the relationship between Pakistan and the United States. Now, the West is not just the United States. You're sitting in London and you know that better than I do. And therefore, Pakistan's, I think, relationships, multiple relationships with several European countries remain very strong. The EU is Pakistan's largest trading bloc, of course, the largest export destination still remains the United States for Pakistani goods. So, I mean, there are multiple relationships. I mean, with the UK, for example, the relationship is very strong. It is, sort of underpinned by historical sort of ties as well as by greater commercial ties between the two countries. But with the US, because that's how you started your question, I think we will have to wait and see how the two countries are able to find, explore new areas of cooperation, because there are many areas where Pakistan and the United States can mutually, can cooperate for mutual benefit. Counterterrorism remains a key area, but also because Pakistan still has a significant position in the OIC, in the Muslim world. It's an important Muslim country, and then, of course, as you yourself stated, it's one of the world's few nuclear weapon states. There are many areas that the two countries can explore. But for now, I think, as I said before, it's really the Pakistan-China relationship. China happens to be now the biggest investor in Pakistan. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is the pivot of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which, as you know, is the biggest and the most ambitious economic enterprise of the 21st century. So, Pakistan's sort of traditional strategic relations with China have now been augmented by a very strong economic dimension. And therefore, I think the US-Pakistan relationship will have to be worked around that. That doesn't mean that Pakistan sees its relations with either China or the United States in a zero-sum way. But as I said earlier, the space is circumscribed somewhat because America is now rounding up countries to join its anti-China containment policy. The entire Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States is designed to curb China's rise as a global power, even though China has already risen, but to contain it. And therefore, that kind of limits what Pakistan can do with the United States. I mean, take the Indian Ocean, for example. I think some of the sort of Cold War dynamics that we see in the South China Sea are now being injected into the Indian Ocean, which is part of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States. And that is compelling Pakistan to also enhance its naval presence in the Indian Ocean. So there are many security implications also that are flowing now from America's contained China policy, which are impacting on the bilateral relationship.
So, as you mentioned, a key component of Pakistan's relationship with China and the United States is India. And this is a question that's actually come up in the chat. And it's interesting to see of all of Pakistan's neighbors, it seems that relations are actually the most stable with India at the moment. If looking at Afghanistan and Iran, where you've seen more open frictions. But my question is, does the potential of a Nawaz Sharif government in Islamabad raise the prospects of a potential rapprochement in the relationship with Delhi, given that relations have historically improved when Sharif has been in power? You'll recall the Lahore bus diplomacy that happened back in 1999, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Pakistan on Nawaz Sharif's birthday. I think it was in 2015. So I think, do you see prospects for a potential improvement in relations under another Sharif government?
Well, that's a big question because of what you have just mentioned, which is that relations warmed when Nawaz Sharif was last in power, and that he had, a relationship, I think, that he was able to forge with Prime Minister Narendra Modi that helped in easing tensions between the two countries. But here's the problem. Because, it takes two to clap and two to tango. One will have to wait and see how Delhi responds to a new government in Pakistan if it's led by Nawaz Sharif. Because in recent years, Delhi has shown absolutely no interest in re-engaging Pakistan diplomatically, in resuming the dialogue, the formal dialogue between the two countries. And in fact, its actions in occupied Kashmir, subsequent to its formal annexation, have only made the situation much more fraught between the two countries. I think the challenge is going to be whether and how the two countries can, re-engage, resume the peace dialogue when India refuses to even talk about Kashmir. It's just sort of struck it off the negotiating table and said, no, we've resolved the issue and we resolved it on our terms. Now, that's not accepted by Pakistan because the international nature of the dispute remains. It's still on the agenda of the UN Security Council. There are UN Security Council resolutions, just like there are on Palestine. But as we've seen on Palestine, they've been flouted. The way they've been flouted is, shocking in recent months, as we all know, what has happened in Gaza. But similarly, in occupied Kashmir too, the Indian government has just completely ignored what UN Security Council resolutions call for. For example, its action of August 2019 flew in the face of several Security Council resolutions that say very clearly that neither party to the dispute can bring about any material change in the ground situation. And clearly the ground situation has been changed by India's action. So, I mean, I mention all of that because this will have to be addressed in some way. And then, other than these long-standing disputes, there have been more irritants that have been injected into the relationship in recent years. For example, one of the treaties which have been the most successful between India and Pakistan, which is the Indus Water Treaty, which governs the sharing of waters between the two neighbors, which has really stood the test of time since it was forged in 1960. There have been differences between the two countries. In fact, India is the one that said we want to change the dispute resolution mechanism which this treaty provides, and we want to replace it with something else. And that has also, emerged as a new irritant in the relationship, because if this treaty unravels, and I think it won't, but India's new action, if you like, or new position, did raise this sort of fear that this treaty could unravel in some form, which would hardly be in the interest of either country. So I think, some of these issues, these are big challenges in the India-Pakistan relationship. But let me go back to my original point. Pakistan's government, whichever one is elected on day after tomorrow, will have to deal with the economy first and foremost. If the economy continues to be in the most severe crisis that it has ever faced in all of Pakistan's history, then I'm afraid all foreign policy is besides the point. Unless Pakistan is able to deal with its economic policy through wide-ranging reforms and structural reforms, not just bailouts. And remember, the new government, I know this, you didn't ask me this question, but it's so related to what I'm talking about. By April, Pakistan's standby agreement with the IMF will be over. Yep. So the new government, one of the first tasks of the new government would be to negotiate a longer-term IMF program, which in turn will require structural economic measures, which will be painful, but which a new government would have to undertake if it is to get the economy back on track and on a path of sustained economic growth. Because inflation is running at a record high. And at the moment, the cost of living crisis, which, Farzana was also sort of alluding to, it is really taking its toll on people. Now, given that, you can imagine, the priority of any government would be domestic. A domestic priority, economic challenge, and then, of course, the foreign policy part, especially the neighborhood part.
Farzana, you wanted to comment on that?
I just wanted to pick up on some of these points with relation to the next government, assuming, as we all assume, it's likely to be led by former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, whose party manifesto emphasizes closer relations with India, peace with its neighbors, but also strengthening relations with China. And I was just wondering, how precisely he is going to balance this. On the one hand, closer relations with India, but at the same time, strengthening relations with China. So that, I sort of anticipate turbulence there. But more importantly, and of course this would hark back to some of the earlier experiences of a Sharif-led government, and that is, the relations with the military when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, I think it's no secret that, relations with Pakistan's immediate neighbors, India and Afghanistan, have been jealously guarded by Pakistan's military as its prerogative. And just a couple of weeks ago, we heard General Asim Munir send out a very clear signal and spelt out in these terms that there can be no reconciliation with India because India has not reconciled itself to Pakistan. And I wonder whether that message was intended as much for India as it was to a new Sharif-led government whose eagerness and willingness to pursue rapprochement with India is well known, not just on issues like settling the dispute over Kashmir, but also because the Sharif government has let it be known that Pakistan's economy, if it is to advance and to strengthen, will depend on closer trade relations with its neighbors. And so, many of these circles remain, as it were, to be squared, and it's not obvious how it's going to happen.
Exactly. I'm conscious of the time.
Can I just come in? Can I just respond very quickly to one of Farzana's points? I think we have to also keep in perspective the historical facts. One of the longest period of, let's say, diffusion of tensions, sustained peace process, sustained dialogue between India and Pakistan was actually under a military government, under President Musharraf. So I think one has to be careful in saying that the military is there just to be a spoiler in any process of relations, of building relations between India and Pakistan. And I think one can't also take the India factor out. As I said before, it takes two to tango. We will need to see, irrespective of what the Pakistani military may think or may not think right now, we need to also see, once the Indian election is over, because nobody's in Delhi is going to move before the Indian election. But let's assume that Narendra Modi returns to power. We will still have to wait and see what his stance is towards some of the hard issues that have to be dealt with. And I think another sort of recent historical fact which has to be kept in view is that under the previous army chief, General Bajwa, he was very much in favor of resuming trade relations with India. And it was in fact Imran Khan's government which said, no, we can't do this right now because of the dispute over Kashmir. So I think we need to be very clear and not, create these dichotomies which sometimes are, in a way belied by the historical experience. So I think we have to wait and see how the two countries will square up. And I don't think there is any tension between Pakistan's continued close relationship with China, and if it was to open up, let's say, dialogue with India, I don't see the contradiction there. India itself has a huge trading relationship with China. You're able to deconflict many of these things when you carry on. This is not, you can carry on certain kinds of relationships with a country while, being reticent about other aspects of relationships. So I don't see that really coming in the way. It didn't come in the way before because the Pakistan-China relationship is not breaking news. It's been around for a very long time. It's been the cornerstone of Pakistan's foreign policy for almost 6.5 decades, if not more. So therefore, and we've had periods of, let's say, rapprochement, if I can use that word, with India in the past. And as I said, one of the longest, most sustained periods was under a military dictator.
Conscious of the time, I do want to open up to audience questions, but I have one last question for you, Adnan, and that is building on something that the ambassador mentioned on the economic side. At present, we have 3 countries in South Asia that are in the midst of IMF bailouts. We have Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. But unlike, say, Bangladesh, where the opposition is virtually non-existent, or Sri Lanka, where you have a high degree of, I think, cross-party consensus on the kind of reforms that need to be implemented. Pakistan's highly confrontational politics makes it, very difficult to pass any meaningful reforms or any consistent reform agenda. So my question here is, again, going back to the domestic politics, implementing some of these difficult austerity measures that the IMF will require in the context of its domestic or divisive political environment. How do you see that potentially playing out?
Well, I suppose I'm a little bit less I'm a little to be diplomatic. I mean, I think that there is a sort of a narrative of reform, austerity. You need to. I think that Pakistan's political economy is unsustainable because there are a lot of very powerful groups who want resources. And the way that Pakistan has funded that is through essentially relying on essentially geopolitical rents from neighbors to provide sort of the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia, China, the US during the Musharraf years, huge amounts of money, which essentially created a situation of what in economics is called Dutch disease, where people moved into sort of doing domestic construction and malls and sort of consumption, as opposed to sort of investment in export industries like textiles and things like that. That's been hollowed out. So actually what Pakistan needs, as much as it needs structural reform, is investment. People need to get interested in and excited by the sort of opportunities and potentials of the Pakistani economy, which is quite significant. And actually, those assets are relatively cheap relative to India, for example, and other things. But I think that there is sort of instability that's sort of been sort of absorbed into the sort of international investment community, with the exception of China and the structures. So, I mean, I think that this is a much longer conversation. I mean, I'm sure we could do an entire week on the Pakistan economy. But it's not just, okay, well, you take the medicine and then you're better. It's more like, what is the future of Pakistan's economy, especially in a situation where we've had sort of a deglobalization, right, where all these blocks and trade is much more sort of complicated. But anyway, so.
Thank you for that. On that note, let's open up to questions. Please do raise your hands if you're in the room. If I call on you, please state your name and affiliation. And please make it a short and sharp question, not a long-winded statement, if you don't want me to cut you off. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thanks so much. Josh Dolder, I work for a political consultancy firm. I just like to ping up on your last point about Pakistan investment. Where is the kind of China-Pakistan economic corridor currently at, particularly in like the kind of security situation in the southwest? And has that kind of slowed down investment from China going forwards?
Ambassador Lodi, would you like to answer the question on the status of CPEC?
I think there has been a perception that CPEC, or the China-Pakistan economic corridor, work on that slowed down, and that perception is correct. But the slowdown occurred during the COVID years. Subsequently, it's picked up, economic activity has picked up, and we are now in the second phase of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And Chinese investment is very much on the uptick. So I think things are moving, and they're moving in the right direction. But of course, the overall macroeconomic framework does impact on investment from anywhere, including from strategic ally China. So Pakistan, if it wants really to quicken the pace of the corridor itself and all the activities that come under that, it needs to address its macroeconomic crisis, which will continue until Pakistan is able to embark on a broad range of comprehensive structural economic reforms, which will give confidence then, not just to investors from China or from the West, but to investors at home. Because unless the business community in Pakistan itself has enough confidence to invest, we're not going to see a great deal of FDI coming into Pakistan. So that's the biggest challenge in my mind for the next government.
Thank you very much for your dissertation. The entire leadership of the Pakistan... Sorry?
Your name?
Oh, yes. My name is Nisar Ali Shah. I'm a journalist by profession. The entire leadership of the Pakistan PTI has been imprisoned. Not only Imran Khan, his former ministers, officials, and all those people are either left the party or they do not want to participate in the party. So my question is that Pakistan keep returning the same family time after time, either in Zardari or in Nawaz Sharif party. So this actually, what is the purpose of this election? Because the military has already decided which party should win. And I think it's going to Nawaz Sharif party. The diaspora in UK and USA, Middle East, and every other country where Pakistanis are settled, they support Imran Khan's PTI party. Do the Pakistani overseas have a vote for election or not?
Neither of you.
I'll respond to that very quickly by saying that yes, I think it's no secret that we've seen the harassment and hounding of a party that is believed by many to be the most popular party in Pakistan. But let's also be clear. I think there are many who also believe that elections by themselves will not guarantee stability. What elections do is to provide some kind of legitimacy for a government. They are necessary, but not a sufficient condition for instability and for stability. And really, to my mind, the only way in which one can advance the program of stability in Pakistan, which is now arguably in one of its most polarized states that I can recall. One real genuine way forward is really to be able to reach some kind of political settlement involving all parties. Now, what I'm talking about here is some kind of national consensus. And implausible as that may sound in the polarized circumstances that we face today, there is a precedent. In 2006, the Pakistan People's Party and the Pakistan Muslim League, led by Sharif, otherwise, daggers drawn and hardened foes, signed what was known as the Charter of Democracy, which, amongst other things, committed both sides to settle and resolve their differences amongst themselves without approaching the military in order to tackle their rivals. So, I really feel that it's that kind of landmark achievement, which holds a particular relevance at this time, when Pakistan is once again mired in allegations of military interference in its politics, when once again Pakistan is mired by allegations of political parties acting as the enablers of the military by looking to it to oust its rivals. Now, I really do think that we need a reckoning, a fresh reckoning along those lines, because without it, Pakistan is likely to be doomed to remain in this state of what can only be described as cyclical dystopia, characterized by another meaningless election, another debilitated government, another divided house, and round we go.
Thank you for that. I've seen two questions that have come up on the online, which are on the same issue, and this is about Imran Khan's outreach to the Middle East and the extent to which this can be continued or rebuilt under a future Sharif administration. So, Ambassador Lodi, would you like to comment on that?
I don't know what outreach the questioner means. Actually, Khan's foreign policy left Pakistan's relations with many countries in a state of disrepair, including our key strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia. So I think the question then is, what will happen in the future, I think if we look at that without really going into what Imran Khan did or didn't do, then yes, I think Pakistan's next government will continue to want to strengthen its strategic and economic ties with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, an important strategic economic partner of Pakistan, and of course with the rest of the Middle East. And on Gaza, as you know, Pakistan has taken a very strong position in line with what its public want its government to do. So they've been, I mean, the government has been very clear, although it's an interim caretaker government, but they have reinforced and reiterated Pakistan's traditional policy, which is to say, that the Israeli occupation should end, and that this war should be brought to an end as soon as possible, and that a ceasefire is the need of the hour, which is why Pakistan has voted consistently with the rest of the Muslim world in UN General Assembly resolutions. So, Middle East is not just Saudi Arabia. The Middle East is a very big region. And I think Pakistan, with its relationship with Iran, as you had asked earlier, in a state of, I think it's still in a state of disrepair. It'll have to focus its attention on, how this relationship can be mended, particularly by getting some kind of an agreement on how to manage the border, because that is the root cause of the recent tensions between the two countries. As I said, both countries accusing the other of providing sanctuary, whether by default or by design, to armed groups on their territory, which carry out cross-border attacks. So I think the Middle East is a huge region, and it's an area of great priority in Pakistan's foreign policy. But I think of all the countries in the Middle East, it's the Saudi-Pakistan relationship which will remain the centerpiece of its Middle East strategy.
I can see that we have one more question, but I want to ensure a degree of gender balance in the questions being asked. So are there any women in the audience who'd like to ask a question? Yes, please, go ahead.
I work for a strategic communications company in London, and my question is, why does Pakistan treat its threat from Iran, its border with Iran, differently to how it treats the threat from the border it shares with Afghanistan and India?
Ambassador Lodi, would you like to?
I don't know what really, I don't know what you mean by that. I think any cross-border threat, Pakistan treats in the same way, but there is no parallel. Keeping India aside, there's no parallel to how the TTP has been attacking Pakistan and Pakistan security forces over the years, but particularly in the last 2 years, from its safe haven in Afghanistan. You can't compare that to some of the groups that are residing in Iran, in Iranian Balochistan. The two threats are of a completely different order. So I think, and Pakistan has responded appropriately to both. It has made it clear that any cross-border threat is going to be something which will be taken very seriously by Pakistan. But I don't know how this applies to India, because I think the relationship with India is of a completely different kind and a different order, as we all know. But I don't know how much you want to go into that, so I leave it there.
I think one potential differentiator that comes to mind is the issue of subnationalism. When you have the tensions with Iran are tied to the Baluch separatist insurgency in Balochistan. But I see this one last question here, so go ahead.
A member of Chatham House, name is Iqbal. As for that gentleman's views, the question is for Dr. Adnan. Qaid-e-Azam said that the military or army should be under the control of public representatives. And that's a very, accepted statement by him. So people have to cross the deadlines of the army to fulfill the dream and the statement of the founder of Pakistan. So why you think that PTI under Imran Khan is breaching the red lines. The red lines have to be breached to fulfill the main objective of Qaid-e-Azam.
Yes, I mean, well, indeed, Qaid-e-Azam, his dream of Pakistan is very different from the Pakistan that we have at the moment. So all I meant was these are the red lines that the army has, which led them to act very differently in relation to Imran Khan. I will say that I think that there has been, over time, a sort of sense that the military has that they're more loath to actually get involved in overthrowing governments, as we saw with Musharraf and others. I mean, this is, now we're talking about the fourth election, right?
You mean they're averse to a formal military takeover?
A formal military takeover. So the idea is that there's, in any country, and this is true in Latin America, this is true in lots of different contexts, in which the military is a powerful institution and has lots of resources and lots of political power, which is just the reality. It's not something I wish. It's not a normative sort of goal. There needs to be some kind of an arrangement, as Farzana was saying, as sort of a political settlement, which allows the civilian government to exercise their own authority internal to areas in which the military is not very worried about. And the military is mostly concerned about internal security, foreign policy, and defense.
Privileges.
There are privileges, indeed, but they're privileges that just objectively that they have at the moment. So the issue with Imran Khan is that he was coming in not with the resources, not with the very organized political party, the entire country behind him to tell the military to stop, but rather coming in and calling his supporters out onto the streets to prevent him from being arrested. And part of the dynamic, I think, at that point is that the military gets very, very worried that there could be more chaos, right? And so as a result, I think he's acting very, very differently. So I'm not saying that this is good, but I am saying that it is a way of thinking about how the military thinks about these things.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to wrap up. We're already over time, but you can continue this conversation afterwards. But on that note, thank you all for joining us today. We will be doing more work on Pakistan and South Asia more broadly, so please keep an eye on the Chatham House website, and if you would like, please sign up for the Asia Pacific Program newsletter, and please join me in thanking or giving a round of applause to our panelists.